The air in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn, was thick and heavy in the pre-dawn hours of June 30th, 1991. It was 3 in the morning, a time when the city that never sleeps takes a moment to grab some shut-eye. For Joe Jones, a private security guard, this was the heart of his shift. He had a monotonous patrol around an abandoned building, a landscape of urban decay that was all too common in New York City at the time. The city was in the grip of a crime wave that felt apocalyptic, and neighborhoods like Bed-Stuy were on the front lines. But even in a place accustomed to violence, what Jones was about to witness would stand out as particularly chilling. His attention was drawn to a man lingering behind the building, his movements secretive and out of place even for that hour. The man was near a large industrial dumpster, and something about his presence set off every alarm in the veteran guard's mind. Jones watched him, the suspicion growing with every passing second. When the man finally noticed he was being observed, he didn't flee immediately. Instead, there was a brief, tense interaction before he got into his car and drove away, melting back into the city's labyrinthine streets. But he left behind a scene that felt deeply wrong, and Jones wasn't about to go investigate alone. Trusting his instincts, Jones recruited a friend who happened to be working in the area as well. Together they approached the dumpster with a sense of extreme caution. They began to cautiously sift through the layers of debris inside, not fully sure what they were going to find. And then it happened, and their hands immediately stopped when they saw it. It was a woman's hand, pale and lifeless amidst the garbage in the dumpster. The cops were called, and the woman would soon be identified as Soo-Ya Kim, who just hours prior had been full of life. To understand the depth of the tragedy, you have to understand the life that was stolen. Soo-Ya Kim's story was, in many ways, the quintessential American dream. In 1981, she and her husband, Soo-Young Kim, married in their native Seoul, South Korea, and soon after, made the monumental decision to move to the United States. They arrived in New York City, a place that has long promised a new start and potential wealth to those willing to work hard for it. The Kims began their journey in the bustling, chaotic world of flea markets, honing their business sense and saving every dollar they could. Their hard work paid off, and they eventually achieved their dream of becoming business owners, opening 2 popular clothing stores. As their business grew, so did their family, and Soo-Ya and Soo-Young had 2 sons, and the family was the center of their world. They eventually moved into a spacious apartment in Queens, a world away from the rundown flea markets where they had started. Just 5 days before she was slain, Soo-Ya and Soo-Young had celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary, a milestone of a life they thought they would share for decades to come. The day Soo-Ya Kim disappeared, June 29, 1991, began like any other Saturday. It was an ordinary afternoon, and she left her 2 young sons in the care of their grandmother and set out on a routine shopping trip. It was the kind of mundane task a busy mother and business owner performs without a second thought. But on this day, it was a trip from which she would never return. At 8 p.m., Soo-Young came home from work, expecting to find his wife and their home filled with the familiar sounds of life going on as normal. Instead, he was met with an unnerving silence, and Soo-Ya wasn't there. He made calls to friends and family members, but no one had seen her and no one knew where she could be. What followed was the longest night of Soo-Young's life, a sleepless vigil filled with escalating dread and unanswered questions. The hope that she would walk through the door at any moment slowly eroded, replaced by a terrifying certainty that something was terribly wrong. The next day, his worst fears were realized when he was summoned to the medical examiner's office. There, he was asked to do the unthinkable: identify the body of his wife, The woman he had built a life with, the mother of his children, had been found slain, her body discarded miles from their Queens home in a part of Brooklyn she had no reason to be in. This geographic disconnect was one of the first and most significant hurdles for investigators. With no known destination for her shopping trip and no clear reason for her presence in Bedford-Stuyvesant, there was no obvious primary crime scene. When detectives from the New York Police Department arrived at the scene, they were confronted with a crime of vicious personal violence. Soo-ya Kim had the clothing removed from her body, and she had been stabbed 9 times. The medical examiner, however, found no evidence of an indecent assault, a crucial detail that complicated any attempt to profile the perpetrator. The crime appeared to have been an act of unrestrained rage towards a woman who had no known enemies. Joe Jones was deemed to be a credible eyewitness, and he provided a description of the suspect and his vehicle, which led to the creation of a police sketch that was circulated to the public. He was a white male with blonde or light brown hair, standing around 5 feet 6 inches, with an average build. And I want you to keep this description in mind, because I'm going to be coming back to it when we discuss theories of the case. But regardless of this starting point, the case went cold, and to understand why, it's perhaps important to realize the magnitude of crime in NYC in 1991. In 1991, New York City recorded over 2,500 slayings, and to put that in perspective, in 2024, this number was just 377. And just to put this a little further into perspective, this was about 7 crimes of the most severe nature, literally each day, every day. To say that detectives were overwhelmed and had little time to dedicate to cases would be a massive understatement. Detectives were assigned an unmanageable number of cases, forensic labs were severely backlogged, and patrol officers were in a constant state of response. The cops turned to the show Unsolved Mysteries to try to resolve her case, but ultimately, this led to nothing, and the case went cold. Over the years, numerous theories have been proposed on who committed this horrible act to Soo-ya. One of the most prominent theories points to Joel Rifkin, one of New York's most prolific serial predators. Rifkin was active from 1989 to 1993, a timeline that perfectly overlaps with Soo-ya's attack in June 1991. He confessed to taking 17 lives, and his reign of terror haunted the city. However, a closer look at his methods reveals significant contradictions with the facts of the Kim case. Rifkin's victimology was chillingly consistent. He exclusively targeted vulnerable women whose disappearances he believed would go unnoticed or unreported. Soo-ya Kim, a married mother, a respected entrepreneur, and a woman with deep community ties, doesn't fit his victim profile in any way. Furthermore, Rifkin's modus operandi was starkly different, and he took substantial efforts to prevent identification of his victims. Perhaps the most compelling evidence against this theory is Rifkin himself. Upon his capture in 1993, he provided a detailed, exhaustive confession to 17 slayings, even drawing maps to help police locate remains of a large percentage of these victims. He has never mentioned Soo-ya Kim, and no direct evidence links him to the case. Notably, while the forensic sketch might appear to look like Joel Rifkin, since it depicts a white male with light brown hair and glasses, other factors don't add up. Joel Rifkin stands about 6 feet 2 inches tall and had an imposing physical presence. Joe Jones described a short man of average build, and given that he was a security guard used to observing and reporting, I think we can put more weight on his assessment than normal. Some have also found a resemblance between Rex Heuermann and the forensic sketch, but again, like Rifkin, he exclusively targeted marginalized women. Also, again, the physical profile just doesn't fit with Heuermann, since he's even taller and more physically imposing than Rifkin. Personally, I think the most probable explanation is the most chilling one of all. Soo-ya Kim appears to have been the victim of a random violent crime. She was likely a tragic casualty of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, in a city teeming with violence. The perpetrator was likely not an infamous monster with a long list of victims, but an anonymous predator, just one more opportunistic attacker created by the city's chaos. He was a person who, after committing a brutal slaying, was probably able to disappear back into the anonymity of millions. His crime went unsolved because the system designed to catch him was too fractured and overwhelmed to do so. This is, of course, a conclusion that offers no comfort or potential neat resolution. Unfortunately, given the lack of any forensic evidence connected with the attacker, the chances of this cold case being solved anytime soon are slim, barring a confession from the perp himself. Hey everyone, Jimmy here asking you to hit that hype button and hype up this video. I'm not entirely sure what this does, but apparently it increases the visibility of the video to new and returning viewers, so this would be a huge favor. Also, don't forget to check out my other YouTube channels, Lazy Chill History and Lazy Chill True Crime, for more content. The routine of a cruise ship is a meticulously choreographed performance of comfort and care. For a cabin steward aboard the Mercury in late August 2004, that routine included a small, final touch each evening, placing a fresh chocolate on the pillow of each guest. But for 5 consecutive days, as the ship carved its way through the cold Alaskan waters, the steward performed this ritual in cabin 6064 with a growing sense of dread. The bed was always pristine, the chocolates from the previous night untouched. He knew his passenger, a 40-year-old woman named Marion Carver, was gone. He reported his concerns to his supervisor each day, only to be told to focus on his job and get back to work. No one reported that Marion was gone, at least not immediately, and to this day, her case remains a disturbing cruise ship mystery. Marion Carver was a 40-year-old mother to a 13-year-old daughter living in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Described as an independent and sometimes spontaneous woman, she had a background as an investment banker and had attended Harvard. True to her spontaneous spirit, she booked a 7-day Alaskan cruise on the Mercury, just 2 days before it was set to sail. On August 27, 2004, she boarded the vessel in Seattle alone, and crucially, she didn't tell another soul that she would be doing it. The official timeline of her presence on the ship is brutally short. A cabin attendant last saw her on the evening of August 28th, only the 2nd day of the voyage, and after that, Marion Carver vanished. Her bed went unused, and she received no room service after the 28th, nor did she use her card for any purchases. The cruise line would later confirm that she never disembarked at any of the scheduled ports of call. For all intents and purposes, after her 2nd night at sea, Marion Carver ceased to exist on the ship. On September 3, 2004, the Mercury completed its journey, docking in Vancouver, British Columbia. To the surprise of no one watching this, Marion Carver didn't disembark. A supervisor instructed the cabin steward to box up her personal belongings left in the cabin. In a shocking breach of protocol and basic human decency, her clothes were reportedly donated to charity, while other personal effects were placed in a storage locker. No missing persons report was filed with the Vancouver police or any other authority. The cruise line made no attempt to contact Marion's family to inquire about her whereabouts or inform them she had not left the ship. The alarm was finally raised weeks later, not from the high seas, but from a phone call on land. Marion's 13-year-old daughter became worried when she couldn't reach her mother for an extended period. She called her grandfather, Kendall Carver, sharing her concern. That call set in motion a search that would consume the rest of Kendall Carver's life. He contacted the Cambridge Police Department in Massachusetts, who opened a missing persons investigation. It took police 3 painstaking weeks to piece together Marion's last known movements, eventually tracing her credit card records to find out where she had went. And just to reiterate, she had never told anyone, not even her daughter, that she was going on this spontaneous cruise. When Kendall Carter finally contacted the cruise line, it was October, and he was met with what he claimed was a wall of indifference. It took the company 3 full days just to confirm that Marion had been a passenger on the Mercury. By that point, 26 days had passed since her disappearance. When a manager finally spoke with him, the explanation was allegedly dismissive. The representative suggested it was normal for passengers to leave belongings behind, and that she may have just walked off the ship undocumented in Vancouver. There was no mention of the cabin steward's 5 days of reports. This response revealed a critical flaw in how incidents at sea were handled. Occurring outside the immediate jurisdiction of any single police force, a disappearance at sea created a legal and informational void. The cruise line became the sole gatekeeper of all evidence and information, including witnesses, internal reports, and the surveillance footage. A significant legal battle ended up taking place between Kendall Carver and the cruise line, and Carver would emerge victorious from this ordeal. Notably, through the discovery process, he was able to obtain all the internal evidence the cruise ship line wouldn't turn over. Despite this victory, he was unable to get any meaningful answers as to what happened to his daughter, which was ultimately what he wanted from the case. In February 2013, there was a startling development in the case. Remains were discovered on Mary Island, a small island in the Strait of Georgia in British Columbia, a province in Canada right next to Washington State. The location was geographically plausible. Lying in the general region the Mercury would have passed on its way to or from Alaska. Canadian authorities suspected the remains could be those of Marion Carver. Police contacted Kendall Carver in Arizona, raising the possibility that DNA testing could finally provide a definitive answer to what happened to his daughter. Notably, it's unclear if these remains were hers, since while the initial finding was reported, nothing subsequent was, and Marion is still officially listed as missing. With no solid evidence of what happened to Marion, a number of theories have taken hold. One theory argues that a predator may have relied upon the transient population and the complex jurisdictional issues of a cruise ship to target Carver. According to some, cruise ships are targeted by these predators who see it as the place to commit the perfect crime, where legal complexities will simply shield them from consequences. Notably, some have suggested that Marion may have done it herself, given that she took the trip without informing anyone. However, her family denies this and confirmed that she would routinely travel at the absolute last minute without informing others. Personally, this seems odd to me, but people are allowed to have unusual character traits, and we can't all be the same. Notably, she never expressed any ideas like that, and there was no note left behind, or anything to indicate this could potentially be the case. Another common theory is that she accidentally fell overboard. People often become seasick on cruise ships, and this combination of being dizzy and throwing up over the deck can cause accidents to occur. Notably, I wasn't able to find the specific railing height for the Mercury, but it looks like the minimum railing on passenger vessels around that time was about 40 inches. I'm no expert on ocean-going vessels, so I can't really say if this is enough to ensure an adult can't accidentally go overboard, but I suspect it isn't. This is doubly true if someone is seasick and is leaning over the edge. Marion's case continues to remain unsolved and heavily discussed, especially given the bizarre circumstances surrounding her case and the fact that it happened on a cruise ship. The night of January 3rd, 1804, was cold, damp, and oppressively dark in the village of Hammersmith, then a small rural outpost on the western fringe of London. Its unlit passages, like the notorious Black Lion Lane, were narrow and enclosed by high hedges, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead even on a clear night. But this was not a clear night, and a mist crept up from the river, and a deeper, more chilling fog of fear had settled over the community for months. This was a named terror, a phantom that stalked the churchyard and its surrounding lanes, a specter the locals called the Hammersmith Ghost. Just after 11 o'clock, a lone figure dressed entirely in white moved through the gloom of Black Lion Lane. From the shadows, another man emerged, armed to the teeth and potentially boozed to the hilt, ready to face this so-called ghost. He leveled his weapon and shouted a challenge into the darkness, and when he got no response, he started blasting. The shooter, a 29-year-old officer named Francis Smith, cautiously approached what he believed was the vanquished specter that had terrorized his neighbors. But instead of a pile of ectoplasm, he found warm, solid flesh. Instead of a shroud, he found the clean white work clothes of a local tradesman. The ghost was Thomas Millwood, a 22-year-old bricklayer, his white flannel waistcoat and linen trousers now rapidly staining red. In a single panicked moment, a ghost story had been brutally inverted. The hunt for a supernatural monster had ended in a very human tragedy, and the true horror was not the phantom, but the violence born from the fear of it. This event would pose a profound question to the English legal system, one it was utterly unprepared to answer. Can a man be guilty for slaying a ghost he genuinely believed was real? The tragedy that unfolded in Black Lion Lane was not the result of a single man's rash action, but the culmination of a perfect storm of social hysteria and cultural superstition. For 2 months, from November 1803, the community of Hammersmith had been gripped by a growing panic. The sightings began as whispers and escalated into terrifying tales. Witnesses gave inconsistent descriptions of the apparition, a common feature of collective delusion. Some saw a tall figure draped in a white burial shroud, while others reported a more monstrous creature wearing a calfskin hide, complete with horns and large, ghastly glass eyes. Basically, think of a minotaur-like monster, and you wouldn't be far off at all. Notably, this phantom wasn't just some passive observer. A local brewer later testified that the entity had leaped from behind a tombstone and seized him by the throat. Unsubstantiated but widely circulated rumors claimed that a pregnant woman had been slain by the ghost. Another story told of a wagon driver who, upon seeing the specter, abandoned his team of 8 horses and 16 passengers to flee in terror. These stories found fertile ground in the cultural soil of the early 19th century, a time when scientific rationalism hadn't yet displaced deep-seated folk traditions. The community quickly developed a backstory for their tormentor, and determined that he was a restless spirit of a man who did the deed to himself. According to prevailing religious doctrine, an individual such as this couldn't be buried in consecrated ground, as it was thought their soul would be unable to find eternal rest. This man, however, had been interred in the Hammersmith churchyard, so his malevolent presence was seen not just as a random haunting, but as a direct consequence of a spiritual transgression, and the entire community was going to pay for it. Compounding the cultural validation of this supernatural fear was a near-total absence of effective law enforcement. The year was 1804, a full 25 years before Home Secretary Robert Peel would establish London's first professional, centrally organized police force. In this pre-Peel era, maintaining order was a fragmented and often inadequate affair, reliant on a patchwork of elected parish constables and paid night watchmen. These men were poorly equipped and lacked the organization to handle a widespread public panic. To give you a sense of the lack of professionality and organization, some of these watchmen were partly paid in fringe benefits like access to alcohol while on the job. The night watchman on duty during the incident himself claimed to have chased the ghost on a previous night, only for it to escape by shooting off its white sheet into his face. And no, you don't have to rewind. This watchman thought a real ghost threw a white sheet at him to escape, like some sort of salamander losing its tail. If you're wondering who was watching the night watchman, it was basically nobody. His response to the crisis wasn't to call for organized backup, but to agree to join Francis Smith's insane, drunken posse of clowns. Notably, while Smith was an officer in the armed forces, he had no official capacity when it came to community policing whatsoever. On the night of January 3rd, two men's paths converged in Black Lion Lane, set on a collision course by a combination of unfortunate choices and the pervasive atmosphere of fear. Thomas Millwood, the young bricklayer, had the profound misfortune of resembling a ghost. His trade required him to wear clothes that were uniformly white: linen trousers, a flannel waistcoat, and an apron, all kept meticulously clean. In the pitch-black, unlit lanes of a village on high alert for a white-shrouded creature, this attire was a serious hazard. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that Millwood had been repeatedly warned about the danger. His family and even his landlord had seen the risk and begged him to wear a dark greatcoat over his work clothes when he went out at night. He had actually already been mistaken for the ghost on at least 2 previous occasions, but he basically wrote off the risks of anything serious happening. Francis Smith, the 29-year-old officer, was by all accounts a respectable and mild-mannered man who was eager to play the role of the hero in this tale. Multiple witnesses at his trial would testify to his humane and kind character, and he cared a lot about his community. He took it upon himself to take a leadership role in the posse that was patrolling the streets for the ghost. Francis was scared of ghosts, as was the style at the time when virtually everyone believed them to be a real threat. Because of this, the local pub offered him a strong drink or two to steel his nerves while he was out there on his ghost-busting mission. After Francis Smith realized the gravity of what he had done, he immediately found help and confessed what happened to 2 men, one of whom was named John Locke. But not that famous John Locke, since he would have been around 170 years old at the time. After transporting the body of Thomas Millwood to the Black Lion Inn with the help of the men, he immediately and promptly surrendered to a local constable expressing remorse. When Francis Smith stood trial at the Old Bailey just over a week later, he wasn't judged by the standards of a terrified villager, but by the cold, rigid logic of 19th century English law. The case exposed a deep chasm between common-sense morality and the strict letter of legal doctrine. Smith was charged with having ended the life of Millwood willfully and pleaded not guilty, his defense resting on the claim that he had made an honest and tragic mistake. He had believed he was confronting a dangerous supernatural entity and was in a state of mortal terror. The jury was clearly moved by this argument. They heard extensive testimony about the widespread panic the ghost had caused, the violent nature of its reported attacks, and Smith's own good character and profound remorse. After deliberating for an hour, they returned a verdict that reflected this sympathy. He was guilty of the much lesser crime of manslaughter, which acknowledged that he committed the act but had no malicious forethought whatsoever. It was a verdict that seemed to align with a sense of fairness and the tragedy that occurred. Literally nobody in the community thought Francis Smith committed this act intentionally in any way whatsoever. However, the presiding judge, Lord Chief Baron Sir Archibald MacDonald, flatly refused to accept the jury's finding. But before you think he's the villain in the case here, his actions would actually save the life of Smith. He informed the jury that, under the law as it stood, there were no circumstances in the case that could reduce the crime. Their only options were to find Smith guilty or to acquit him entirely. MacDonald's reasoning was a masterclass in the inflexible legal interpretation of the era. The judge held that Smith's actions met none of the criteria for the lesser charge. There was no evidence of self-defense, as Millwood had not attacked him, and he had merely advanced down the lane without responding to a challenge. Smith's subjective belief that he was facing a ghost was legally irrelevant. The law judged the objective act, not the actor's mistaken perception. MacDonald's most devastating point, however, was what became known as the best case fallacy. MacDonald, being an educated man of the Enlightenment, didn't accept the idea that a bullet could fell a ghost. The best case fallacy meant that Smith could have only reasonably believed that it was a human prankster impersonating a ghost. Impersonating a ghost and scaring people was a minor public nuisance offense at the time, and was punishable with as little as a warning. It wasn't a felony that could have ever justified the use of such extreme force. This judicial instruction left the jury with no room to maneuver. Trapped by the law's rigid logic, they were forced to reverse their decision and return a verdict of guilty, and this was a capital offense. Francis Smith, the mild-mannered man who set out to protect his community from a phantom, was sentenced to be hanged by the neck. The trial demonstrated how the legal system of the day operated like a machine, incapable of processing the messy, irrational data of human fear and honest error. The verdict wasn't a failure of the judge, who correctly applied the law, but a failure of the law itself to accommodate the complexities of the human mind. The legally correct but morally troubling verdict immediately set other forces in motion, revealing a more complex ecosystem of justice that operated beyond the courtroom walls. And just wait for it, because our friend Lord Justice MacDonald is going to put on a true masterclass of getting the right result while working within the strict confines of the system. The public reaction to Smith's sentence was one of overwhelming sympathy. Contemporary accounts described the courtroom spectators as being deeply moved by his obvious contrition and terror at his fate. The entire country became convinced that the law was going to eliminate an innocent man, and this groundswell of public feeling had an immediate effect. Lord MacDonald, despite his rigid application of the law during the trial, was sensitive to the unique circumstances, and he decided to put the concept of justice above the law. He announced in court that he would immediately report the case to the king, George III. As any fan of this period of history knows, George III was completely mentally incapable by this point, so all royal decisions were made by his son, Prince George. This engaged a parallel justice system, the royal prerogative of mercy, an ancient power allowing the monarch to temper the strict sentences of the courts. The crown acted with remarkable speed, and the sentence was suspended almost immediately, while the crown figured out what to do. A few weeks later, Smith's sentence was officially commuted to 1 year of hard labor, as an acknowledgement that you can't simply get wasted and start blasting in urban areas. He was ultimately granted a full pardon and released after serving only about 6 months of his sentence. This royal intervention was a tacit admission from the highest authority in the land that the law had produced an unjust outcome. While the formal legal system was grappling with the consequences of the shooting, an informal system of social pressure was solving the original mystery. The intense publicity surrounding the trial and the tragic slaying of Thomas Millwood weighed on the conscience of the real, quote-unquote, ghost. 2 days after the shooting, a local boot and shoemaker named John Graham came forward and confessed. His motive was shockingly mundane and disproportionate to the terror he had caused. Graham explained that his apprentice had been scaring his young children with ghost stories. As a form of revenge, Graham decided to dress in a white sheet and frighten the apprentice on his way home through the churchyard. The prank was so successful that he apparently continued it for sport, becoming the infamous Hammersmith Ghost. When he surrendered to the local magistrates, they found themselves in a legal quandary. Given that his normally minor public nuisance offense had led to a tragedy, they were unsure exactly how to charge him. To bring a big case and leave the man with a fine seemed almost insulting to the legacy of Millwood, so they released him on the condition that he never impersonate a ghost again, and according to the historical record, he never did. In one final weird historical mystery arising from this case, something strange began to happen after. People began to claim to see the true spirit of Thomas Millwood in Hammersmith, and at the Black Lion Inn, where his body was taken that night. This has raised the question whether John Graham, the so-called real Hammersmith ghost, was the only person dressing up and scaring people at the time. Given that the ghost sightings went on for years after, I have a few thoughts about this part of the Hammersmith enigma. I suspect John Graham may have continued being a public nuisance regardless of telling the authorities that he wouldn't be one. After all, his initial story is quite odd since he managed to scare his apprentice but just kept doing it anyway. Further, given that the case had become a nationwide phenomenon, I also think that some thrill seekers may have tossed on a sheet in a one-off event. As for the sightings within the Black Lion Inn itself, it seems like a mass hysteria event overlaid upon a sincere belief in ghosts. After all, if there was anyone who would be a vengeful spirit in this situation, it was Thomas Millwood, the innocent man who was walking home in his work-mandated clothing. In April 1998, a disturbing discovery surfaced in a Texas lake. The body of an unidentified woman was found in a waterway between Lake Lavon and Lake Hubbard, just east of Dallas. The victim's face was unrecognizable after weeks in the water, and with no ID or clues to her identity, police categorized her as a Jane Doe, a nameless victim of a violent crime. From the start, authorities recognized that this woman had met a violent end. An autopsy confirmed she had been shot multiple times, and by the time her body was recovered, decomposition suggested she had been dead for 1 to 4 weeks. Investigators suspected she was slain elsewhere and dumped in Lake Lavon, and that her remains drifted through floodgates where she was ultimately found. Nothing obvious was missing, which meant robbery was probably not the motive, though the authorities couldn't say for sure. With no identification, detectives had little to go on in 1998. They entered the case in national databases and dubbed her the Collin County Jane Doe, a name by which she would be known for decades. A forensic artist created a composite sketch of the victim's face to show the public, hoping someone might recognize her features. Despite circulating the sketch and the case details, no one came forward with a name. The mystery woman remained unidentified as months turned into years, and her file slowly went cold. By the year 2024, a new forensic technology was giving hope to cold cases like this, and yeah, stop me if you've heard this one before. In 2024, the Collin County Medical Examiner's Office partnered with Othram and were able to extract a comprehensive genetic profile. From there, they were able to reconstruct her family tree and positively identify her as Penny Gunn in August 2025. The identification of Penny was a landmark moment, and she reclaimed her name after nearly 3 decades of anonymity. Once her identity was known, details of Penny's life began to emerge. Penny was born in 1962, and public records show she lived in multiple states, including Iowa and Washington, before eventually coming to Texas. She had married in the late 1980s and taken the last name Morris. By the late 1990s, Penny was living in the Dallas area, possibly in the city of Garland, just a few miles from where her body was found. This suggests that she was slain close to home. It's unclear whether a missing person report was ever filed for Penny at the time of her disappearance. Some online sleuths have speculated that she may have been reported under her maiden name, though this remains unclear at this time. With Penny's identity restored, the investigation into her slaying is picking up steam again. Detectives are now looking into her past and the people in her life for clues about who might have harmed her. Notably, while it appears from present evidence that she was still legally married at the time of her disappearance, it's unclear if she was separated or not. Investigators will presumably want to speak to her husband or ex-husband, since that individual will almost certainly be of high interest to the investigation. While we don't yet know what happened to Penny, what's clear is that after 27 years, investigators are determined to get answers. They've advised that they're interviewing anyone who knew Penny and retracing her last known steps in Texas. If you knew Penny Morris, who may have gone by her maiden name, I would encourage you to reach out to the Collin County Sheriff's Office. Even if you knew her years prior to what happened, even the most seemingly insignificant piece of evidence could crack this case wide open. On a cold November evening in 1643, with the thunder of cannon fire shaking the walls of Rottweil, hundreds of frightened townspeople gathered inside the Dominican church. Clutching their rosaries, they prayed desperately for deliverance from the siege outside. According to numerous accounts, their prayers were answered in a most startling way. The statue of the Virgin Mary on the altar seemed to come alive. Witnesses said Mary's face shifted in color, and her eyes moved, gazing upward and then back down toward the beleaguered city. Some believed they heard her voice in the hushed church. This 1643 incident, later known as Our Lady of the Turning Eyes, would become one of the most famous miracles of the 30 Years' War. In the autumn of 1643, the walled city of Rottweil, a Catholic stronghold in the Holy Roman Empire, was battered by a siege in the last decade of the 30 Years' War. The French had fully encircled the city, cutting off supplies while the walls of the city withstood bombardment. The situation grew desperate as bombardments breached sections of the aging medieval walls by mid-November. Inside Rottweil, fear and turmoil reigned, and the exhausted defenders argued over whether to hold out or surrender to the enemy, who promised to spare civilians if the city yielded. It was in this dire atmosphere that an extraordinary event was reported. The Dominican friars, together with hundreds of townspeople, held continuous rosary prayers inside Rottweil's Dominican church. According to eyewitnesses, on November 10, 1643, the statue of the Virgin Mary at the altar suddenly changed. The Madonna's face appeared to turn pale, and her carved eyes came to life and moved, shifting upward toward heaven, then downward toward the congregation and the city. Some present even claimed they heard a soft sigh or word from the statue. Both Catholics and a few skeptical Protestants who had taken refuge in the church witnessed this uncanny occurrence. Stunned worshippers were reportedly moved to tears and awe at the sight. News of the miracle of the turning eyes spread through the city in the following days. Many believers interpreted Mary's movements as a direct response to their fervent prayers, as if the Virgin were acknowledging their pleas and interceding with her Son for Rottweil's safety. This helped the besieged Rottweilers' morale immensely, and all talks of giving up the city ceased. On November 25, 1643, about 2 weeks after the first incident, a second phenomenon was reported. Witnesses saw the statue's face, formerly so pale, suddenly become flush with color, as if the statue had once again come to life. Once again, her eyes seemed to shift their gaze, and a few tears were seen glistening on her cheeks. That same night, miles away at Tuttlingen, a relief army of Bavarian, Spanish, and Imperial forces launched a surprise attack on the French camp. The enemy was completely routed in the Battle of Tuttlingen, and the siege of Rottweil was abruptly lifted. To the faithful, the timing was no coincidence. Clearly, the intercession of the Virgin Mary had saved the city. The reported miracle at Rottweil reverberated throughout Catholic Europe. In 1643, the war's 25th year, Catholics saw this event as a powerful sign of divine favor amid chaos. The occurrence came during the Counter-Reformation's peak of Marian devotion, when Mary was often invoked as a heavenly protectress in battle. To the faithful, the Virgin's intervention at Rottweil seemed to confirm that heaven was on their side. Catholic preachers and writers pointed to the episode as proof of their true faith's power, encouraging the devout to persevere. According to contemporary accounts, some Protestants who witnessed the event were reported to have been so moved by the occurrence that they converted to Catholicism. Given the dozens of eyewitness accounts and the rapid spread of the story in print, church authorities took the claims of 1643 very seriously. A formal inquiry gathered the testimony of 42 eyewitnesses, and on March 14, 1644, the church officially confirmed the miracle as worthy of belief. That same year, a printed report of the event circulated in Catholic regions, spreading Rottweil's fame. The church soon became a site of pilgrimage, with many visitors coming to venerate the miraculous image, with some even claiming cures or other favors in Mary's name. There are three common explanations for what happened at Rottweil. The traditional Catholic interpretation views this incident as a genuine miracle. According to this theory, the Virgin Mary, moved by the fervent prayers of the besieged residents, visibly turned her eyes as a sign of compassion, reassurance, and divine protection. Supporters point to the precise timing of the second event, which occurred just before Rottweil was miraculously relieved in the Battle of Tuttlingen. For centuries, this has remained the dominant explanation among believers, solidifying Rottweil's Marian devotion and confirming for many the legitimacy of their Catholic faith. A popular skeptical modern theory suggests that the incident resulted from a psychological phenomenon, specifically mass hysteria or collective delusion induced by extreme stress. In 1643, the residents of Rottweil were under intense psychological strain due to prolonged siege warfare, fear, hunger, and uncertainty. Under these conditions, suggestible individuals may have interpreted subtle visual cues, such as flickering candlelight, shadows, or reflections, as movements of the statue's eyes. According to this view, as news of the event spread, confirmation bias and peer pressure likely reinforced eyewitness accounts, solidifying the event's perceived miraculous nature. Another modern explanation proposes that the phenomenon was the result of a natural optical illusion. The apparent shifting eyes and changes in facial coloration could have been due to shifting light conditions from candles, torches, and reflective surfaces within the church. Wooden statues, painted and varnished, can appear to move subtly depending on the angle of illumination and viewer perspective, particularly under flickering candle light. Small environmental factors like humidity, temperature changes, or minor movements of the statue's supporting structure may also have contributed to the illusion. According to this explanation, this may have convinced observers that they had witnessed a miraculous event. Whatever the case, what's clear is that the first sighting calmed the nerves of the people of Rottweil. The second sighting, 2 weeks later, and coinciding with the break of the siege, appeared to confirm that this event had led to the deliverance of the town.